Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the Seiko SNK381 and why I think it is arguably the best bargain that can be had from the brand and why anyone interested in this watch should get one now. Learning to look at horology from a historical perspective has led me to grow an appreciation for watches more for the fascinating stories they told or fond memories they brought back rather than their regarded value or popularity. Sadly though, that fascination in many cases also presented a side of horror, and for some, certain watches may be reminders of a past that would be better forgotten. Tales from the Vietnam War would perfectly exemplify that case, disgracing our archives with accounts for claiming millions of lives, causing massive environmental destruction, igniting social divide and disbelief in political systems, and severely damaging national economies, among other long-term repercussions that would forever impact the lives of countless individuals and the fate of nations. But in the more shallow context of this discussion, we'll be taking a look at how those two dark decades in history led to the rise of perhaps the most iconic timepieces ever known. Particularly into the watch we have in review for today, or at least 3 vintage references which I personally consider just as iconic despite not getting the attention it truly deserves within the watch collecting community. While it may be more common to categorize watches according to function, let's say diver or flieger, field or dress watch, when it comes to military watches, I tend to think of 2 more general categories: official military issues and R&R watches. For this discussion, I'll be further narrowing down those categories to include only watches that were adopted by the US military during World War II. For the first category, we're looking at watches that were designed and manufactured to strict military specifications for standard issue and practical service in the field. These would include versions of Military Specification 3818, which were first worn by US Army Special Forces, more popularly known as the Green Berets, and the Tornik Rayvel TR900 for issue to a counterpart elite team of naval infantrymen. Common to these watches would be government markings either on the dial or the caseback to indicate serial number, date of manufacture, stock number, or simply a unique symbol associated with the issuing government. The distribution of these watches was mostly kept within troops with critical proficiencies and not universal within the military as many of us may have come to believe, a common practice that would lead us to our next category. R&R or rest and recreation watches would include pieces that were manufactured for civilian use and were often retailed at post exchanges in remote US military installations. American soldiers purchased these considerably cheap watches out of their salaries but proved to be equally reliable in the field, hence their rise in popularity. Notable inclusions in this category would be the Glycine Airman Special, the Zodiac Seawolf, and the Seiko 6105. These 3 Seikos would belong to a special category falling right in between those 2 for being releases intended for the civilian market but would then be sourced in considerable quantities by the US government for standard issue to units of a newly formed elite team, the MACV-SOG. To better understand what the MACV-SOG was, let me share one of the more striking tales I came across in my research for this piece. On Thanksgiving Day of 1968, MACV-SOG Spy Team Idaho leader John Stryker Meyer, together with assistant team leader John Shore and 4 indigenous allies, were pulled out from their detail and forward operating Base 1 to assist FOB-6. The mission? Locate one of 3 missing divisions of the North Vietnamese Army, which accounted for a total of about 100,000 enemy troops, to prevent another likely attack on Saigon or on one of American A camps, similar to the series of surprise attacks collectively known as the Tet Offensive. The operation required a team of 6 to drop off from a chopper past the Cambodian border in plain sight of the enemy on flat land and proceed on foot to gather any available intelligence and, if possible, capture an enemy soldier or a porter that moved supplies through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The chopper had to leave the team and hover miles away from the landing zone to avoid taking casualties from the NVA, which was at the time very common in the area. Further reducing the chances of the team's successful extraction was a particular rule of engagement in Cambodia, which forbids the use of fixed-wing assets for backup in any case of an enemy attack. Insertion was successful, and just within a few minutes, smoke from a fading fire leads the team straight into an idle enemy camp. Tilt promptly starts snapping pictures as the rest of Idaho scouts the periphery. Vietnamese ally and team leader Sao discovers hundreds of fresh footprints within the area and suggests an immediate retreat. Trusting his counterpart's instincts, Tilt orders his team to pull back in spite of desiring to advance further west. and South's instincts were totally correct. Vietnamese troops were moving in Idaho's direction from the south. Greatly outnumbered, the team had no choice but to radio in for support and retreat in the opposite direction. But before covering much ground, South spots enemy troops on a dead run from the north. The team then realizes that they actually came in contact with 2 out of the 3 missing divisions of the NVA. Those attacking from the south were from the division that had just left base camp, and those closing in from the north were from a division moving in. Wildfire began and the race for life was on. 6 MACV-SOG operators had to stay alive in an enemy base camp across an open field against an estimated count of about 30,000 hostiles. The Green Hornets were on the way but were about 10 minutes far from their location. The team fired back, blasting a couple of claymores and lobbing grenades, but the NVA just kept on charging despite taking staggering casualties. The rest of Idaho miraculously makes it to the landing zone and hastily sets up a perimeter as they wait for their chopper. Just as more and more NVA appeared, the UE arrives and guns them down at a devastating rate as Team Idaho climb up the helicopters. Minutes later, all 6 men were safely back at base, about to feast for Thanksgiving for their second and third times. Established on January 24, 1964, the MACV-SOG, or the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, was a highly classified multi-service United States Special Operations Unit primarily consisting of volunteers from the Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Air Force, CIA, and Marine Corps reconnaissance units. Throughout the unit's 8-year activity, the SOG would be tasked to conduct clandestine missions in the republics of North and South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Those missions would include strategic sabotage of enemy assets, counterintelligence, personnel recovery, the capture of enemy prisoners, and psychological operations. Recon teams, typically consisting of 2 to 4 Americans and less than 10 indigenous mercenaries, were specifically instructed to blend in as they carried out their missions behind enemy lines. This meant the need for items such as cameras, knives, and watches that were non-traceable in case of enemy capture. The standard issue watch, with all of its markings, simply failed to provide one essential need of SOG operatives: deniability. That brings us to the first Seiko in reference. More commonly known to watch collectors as the pre-SOG version, this civilian release was not directly issued by the military but was often the choice among American troops for its practicality and reliability. It wasn't until 1968 that these Seikos would be officially issued to the SOG units. Regarded as the first of Seikos to be officially distributed to SOG units, these watches, among other stereo equipment, were directly ordered from the manufacturer by the Counterinsurgency Support Office, then headed by Deputy Director Conrad Baker. Here's a picture of the man with his personal copy of the third and last of these references. Issued in smaller numbers from 1970 until the MACV-SOG's deactivation in 1972, this reference is the most rare of the 3 and is highly sought after in the vintage market. Now let's take a look back at the second reference from 1968 and put it side by side with the current SNK381. 21 jewel automatic movement, similarly sized round steel case, inset crown at 4 o'clock, Seiko 5 shield on a black dial, loomed Arabic numeral markers, loom-filled steel handset with needle type seconds hand, framed day-date window. These watches are nearly identical. The original 6119 retailed for $8 back in 1968. If we factor in the rate of inflation, that money should amount to around $70 in 2023. I recently got this SNK381 brand new for $90. Given its striking resemblance to a vintage reference with legitimate military history, I believe the SNK381 could have cost way more had Seiko thought of releasing it a few years earlier as a 50th year commemorative piece. These entry-level Seiko 5s powered by the 7S26 movement are no longer in production. These SNK381s in particular are getting harder to find at list price as of late. By its looks and reliability alone, I think this watch is easily one of the best bargain field watches from any brand at present. I've learned my Seiko lesson for not getting one of those SKX divers or SARBs before the prices skyrocketed in the reseller market. If you're a Seiko fan, I suggest you strongly consider adding this to your collection while you still can. All 3 vintage references can be found in the market for prices which, with knowledge of their historical significance, are very reasonable in my opinion. I haven't come across one I can afford, but even if I did, I can't see myself deserving the privilege of owning one. Those timepieces that saw real combat in that secret war should more meaningfully retire as heirlooms within families most impacted by the sacrifice they represent. As for me, I'm happy for learning about this secret watch that holds countless real-life secrets of valor, camaraderie, heroism, and sacrifice that up until now I have yet to uncover. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'd appreciate being corrected for any incorrect facts presented here, as well as any personal stories you may want to share. It would also support the channel greatly if you can consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.